Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And today we are going to be talking a bit about the history of the conservative movement and how it intersects a little bit with, of course, one of our favorite libertarians, Murray Rothbard. And to do that, I have on Daniel Flynn today to talk about that. And Daniel's like in a perfect position to talk about some new stuff, some new developments really in this research. And he's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and an American Spectator senior editor. Now, recently he has published a book called The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer, and that's out from Encounter Books just this year here in 2025. And he also wrote recently a column drawing upon some of this research, wrote a column for the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics here at the Mises. Wait, no, this is in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, our other journal, our sister journal to the QJAE. And so we'll link to that. Check that out. But he's focusing on one aspect in the journal article where he had recently uncovered some new research which showed letters, well, literally letters, from Rothbard to Frank Meyer talking about Ayn Rand. And I don't know if you've been around the Mises Institute for a while, you know, kind of like the old talk about this relationship between Rothbard and Ayn Rand. This crops up every now and then. And it was a fairly interesting relationship. And so we have new details about that, some new details about Rothbard's thought. But I'll let Daniel get into the details of that. I don't really need to summarize it or anything. But I think before we get into this relationship between Murray and Rand, we need to talk a little bit about who Frank Meyer was so that we have some context, I think, about what was this discussion about Rand. Why did Murray know Frank Meyer? So, Daniel, I don't think anymore people who follow conservatism or involved in the movement necessarily know who Meyer was. I don't even think they necessarily know who Buckley was, at least in terms of reading a lot of his writings or anything like that. So yeah, tell us about Meyer and the conservative movement and all of that stuff.
Well, you know, when Mike Wallace interviewed Frank Meyer in 1961, he said, "I'd venture to guess that maybe 1 in 1,000 of my viewers knows who you are." And here we are in 2025. I don't think the situation is all that much better. But I'd rather write a biography about someone that we should know rather than like Winston Churchill or Lincoln or someone like that everyone knows everything about. Meyer kind of lived two lives. Initially, he was the Johnny Appleseed of the young communist movement in Great Britain. I have about 160 pages of MI5 and MI6 files, and he is repeatedly referred to as the founder of the student communist movement in Great Britain. And so while he was doing that, here's a guy who was calling for the violent overthrow of Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of England. And at the same time, what these letters that I found prove is that he was having a relationship with Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter, Sheila MacDonald. One of the letters says, "Come to 10 Downing Street. My father's not around." So I don't, pick whatever romantic figure in the history of communism you can come up with, Che Guevara or John Reed. None of them had the gall to pull off what Meyer did. And of course, he was deported, unsurprisingly, from Great Britain. But before he got deported, he was a cause celeb. He had Clement Attlee giving a speech on the floor of the House of Commons. There was a petition that went around with Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, signing it. Michael Straight, who was the publisher of the New Republic later, he says he remembers marching around London chanting "Free Frank Meyer, free Frank Meyer." He comes to the United States. He's sort of a mid-level manager in the American Party. And a number of things happen. One of them, he joins the army and he realized that the proletariat are not these people that Marx had made them out to be. That's a revelation for him because he sort of grew up wealthy in this high-hat hotel in Newark, New Jersey, went to Balliol College, had a lot of social insulation. The other thing that happens is that he reads 1945, that book's The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. And ostensibly, this is a book review of The Road to Serfdom in a communist-controlled publication. And the remarkable thing is that, it's not exactly a positive review, but it's a fair review. It's a mixed to positive review. And it's really not so much a review of Hayek as it is, you're reading a man cracking up that he's having an epiphany, that the 14 years of his life as a communist was a lie. And so he leaves the party, testifies against the Communist Party in the longest, most expensive trial in U.S. history, which is the Smith Act trial in 1948, 1949. By 1955, he's present at the creation of National Review. And I think that's where his story picks up for most people, that Meyer, was this the book review editor for National Review, but he's also sort of the chief ideologist. He kind of was a commissar in the Communist Party, and a little bit he was a commissar in the post-war conservative movement. What I like about his life is there's this Forrest Gump quality where it weaves through in ways large and small with, Eugene O'Neill, Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells. He's the first editor to publish a freelance article by Joan Didion. By the end of the 1960s, even though he's this sort of anti-hippie curmudgeon, Bob Dylan moves next door in Woodstock, New York. So he really pops off the page in a way that a lot of ideologues don't. They live a lot of them live really gray lives, particularly some of the National Review characters. And he lives in Technicolor. He lives in 3D, and he really jumps off the page. And his story with Murray Rothbard picks up in 1954. That's where they meet.
And yes, one of my impressions of Meyer, kind of if I had to define him in one sentence, is that he was really kind of the intellectual power behind National Review, where Buckley was very much the public figure on TV all of the time, and certainly had his own thoughts about things. Reading Meyer, it seems he's trying to engage the material on a much deeper, more philosophical level, at least in my reading. And he would get into these debates with Rothbard, too. There's a book that I have here. It's from ISI called Freedom and Virtue, the Conservative Libertarian Debate, that they put out like 25 years ago or something. It's just sitting on my shelf forever. And it contains essentially essays by both Meyer and Rothbard, taking each other to task on these issues.
Well, what's interesting is that they meet through the Volcker Fund in 1954, and they both become the kind of reviewers of scholarship and books from Volcker. Meyer actually has quite a significant role in the publication of Man, Economy, and State, and that's something I hope to bring out in some subsequent article. He, in 1955, Meyer comes down to Manhattan, and he spends, what sounds like a real jolly time with the Circle Bastiat. He invites them up to Woodstock, and Murray's travel phobias, which I'm sure you know about and a lot of your viewers know about, prevent him from going up to Woodstock, at least at that point. But they have this epistolary correspondence. This is the folder that I have. It's 35 letters. There are, between Rothbard and Meyer, there are some original manuscripts in there. There's some cards and some other articles that Murray clipped. So it's a good chunk of material between the two. I think what's significant is that they never cease to be friends. When Frank died, Murray said, "I took it as a huge blow." Frank's death. Both of them received funding from the Volcker Fund to publish what would be, I think, their big books. Would you say Man, Economy, and State is Murray's big book? There's other books that he wrote that are important too. And for Meyer,
certainly his big economics book, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I read America's Great Depression pretty early on. I think that's an important book. There's other important books that he's written. And for Meyer, the big book that he wrote, it's actually a slim book, is In Defense of Freedom. Both of them wouldn't have been able to do that without the Volcker Fund money. And for the uninitiated, Volcker was kind of bankrolling libertarian and some conservative thinkers in the 1950s all the way into the early 1960s. And both of them were beneficiaries of that largesse. And they both remain friends. I have a letter from Murray where he says, this is in the late 60s, that, why is it that you, and with the possible exception of John Chamberlain, was it that you, Frank Meyer, are the only one at National Review standing up, or in the conservative movement standing up for sort of libertarian principles? So he admired Meyer as, he thought of him as a libertarian. It's certainly debatable whether he was or wasn't, but Murray thought of him that way. Just sort of a libertarian who was an anti-communist.
Well, one thing that I've actually been meaning to ask him about, Lou Rockwell, was an editor at Arlington Press back in late 60s, early 70s, or Arlington House Press.
Sure.
And I have this book here, The Conservative Mainstream by Frank Meyer.
Sure.
He's got this fun picture of him smoking on the back. And it's copyright 1969. It's a collection of essays. It's actually pretty good if you want to read a bunch of short stuff. And I kind of wonder if Lou had been working at Arlington House when this was putting out, if he had any role in this whatsoever. So there's these kind of intersections between the conservatives and the libertarians back then. That was before I think things had hardened quite into the distinct different schools that they have in more recent decades.
Yeah, and I should add, Murray, I have a letter of recommendation from Bill Buckley for Murray when he was kind of hard up in 1957, saying this is a brilliant economist. By 1959, he's singing a very different tune about Murray, and he views him as sort of a gadfly or something worse than that. So obviously, they had a relationship, Murray and Buckley. At one time, it was at least cordial, but that disintegrates. It never disintegrates for Frank Meyer and Murray, and I think that's significant.
Well, so they're sending letters to each other, right? And from the mid 50s into the late 50s, and so the next issue then is, okay, so what picture do we get of Murray and his relationship with Rand through these letters? And I should note that the article, you can get a good sense of this, a summary of this, from this article at the Journal of Libertarian Studies at Mises.org. It's called Murray Rothbard's Lost Letters on Ayn Rand, and these are letters that he sent to Meyer. So the story of Ayn Rand is filled with stories of people who first liked her, and then they were expelled by her group, or they simply left the group in disgust. It seems Rothbard followed a similar path to many others, and so kind of what do you gain from reading these new letters to Meyer?
Well, that there was sort of a roller coaster of emotions and thought with regard to Rothbard concerning Rand. That pretty early on, he had three iterations of interactions with Rand. One was in '52 when the Volcker Fund people took him to meet her. One was in 1954 where he spent a couple days with the sort of inner circle of the Randians. And the final one was in the aftermath of the publication of Atlas Shrugged. Initially, from his letters to Meyer, there's a great deal of exhilaration about the publication of Atlas Shrugged. He said, listen, Meyer, even if you don't disagree with her, you have to hail her as a genius system builder. I disagree with Marx, and I know he was brilliant in his own way. Why don't you come on board with Rand? And so that feeling kind of dissipates when he starts going to meetings, and he starts going into these sort of inner collective, inner objectivist meetings. And part of his problem is philosophical. I think the other part of it is personal. I think with Rand, for a lot of people, it was her temperament. It was her sort of Russian temperament, kind of intolerance, and the idea cultivated by Nathaniel Branden that everyone around her had to be kind of a disciple. Murray wasn't suited for a kind of sycophantic life, to live in someone else's shadow. I mean, even we talked earlier, Man, Economy, and State. I mean, he wrote that book to be a sort of a textbook synopsis of human action, but it becomes its own thing because Murray couldn't help but become his own guy. And so I don't think it was ever going to work. Some of the issues, I mean, one of the things, by December of 1957, he's already joking with Ralph Ryko and Bruce Goldberg and other people about, get a load of these people. They think that animals have natural rights. And so they start making jokes about the natural rights of cockroaches. And, that kind of humor, I mean, that might be characteristic of Murray, but you're not going to be long for that world around the collective if you're making jokes like that. And obviously later they do this play. I don't really get into that in the article, but those kind of jokes expand from there. He talks about them being kind of anti-politics, that they're all about philosophy and metaphysics and that kind of thing. And Murray was, to some degree, a political animal. He believed in private courts. I think there's an irony that the Randians vociferously objected to his idea of private courts, and then later they wanted to haul him into their own private court for a denunciation. But that was one of his objections. He said they don't believe in instincts, and he did believe in instincts. So there was a philosophical divide. But as he said to Meyer, I'm 98% Randian. I believe in natural rights. I believe in Aristotelianism. I believe in free will. I believe in all these things. but I just, I have these few hang-ups. I don't know that it was the philosophical hang-up so much it was the temperament. I mean, there's a story that he tells. There's a number of stories that he tells here. I mean, one of them comes from his wife, where Joanne Rothbard was a Christian, and the Randians wanted to convert her to, I don't know, agnosticism or atheism or whatever it was that they were believing or not believing, and they couldn't do it. And so persuasion started to get kind of annoying. It started to be like browbeating. And Murray was taking psychoanalysis from Nathaniel Branden. And she said, well, I hope this goes well with you, and I hope it goes well with Bruce, and I hope it goes well with Ralph Ryko. But at the end of it, I hope you spit in Nathaniel Branden's face. I mean, that is how visceral it got for Joanne Rothbard, that by December of 1957, she's saying, Murray, I hope this ends, and I hope that you spit in his face when it's over. So he lasts for another 7 or so months within the collective, but even by December of 1957, Murray is saying this isn't going to last, and Joanne Rothbard is saying, hey, spit in this guy's face.
Yeah, I was really struck by it, right? You use the phrase zigzagging, right, to kind of describe where Rothbard was with Rand at any given time based on these letters, and it was fun to read. He goes to Meyer and he's saying in 1 minute, Rand is awful. And then in the next letter, I've reconsidered my earlier opinion of Rand. So it was very fascinating.
I think there was a circle the wagons effect, that when Atlas Shrugged came out, it had a profound impact on a lot of people. I mean, I'm not an objectivist or anything like that, but that whole concept in her books of moochers and looters, I mean, you can't help but look at current news articles and see it through that lens if you've read that book. So I think particularly for people of a libertarian bent, that it was a life-changing event. It was a life-changing event for Murray. So when there became attacks on Atlas Shrugged, all across the board, and a lot of them really condescending attacks on Rand, you had this, I mean, you see this a lot now. I remember when the Dave Chappelle special came out a few years ago, and on Rotten Tomatoes, there was like 100% fresh score from the people, and the critics had given it 0%. Atlas Shrugged was a bit like that, where the people reading it were saying, this is a really great book, and the critics were all saying it stunk. And so I think the zigzag for Murray came in the fact that, boy, I can say, I mean, in this letter in December, he calls her crazy. He says that she's operating a little cult. So a lot of the language that you would see later in the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult, it's present there in 1957. But I think, like within a family, you might feel comfortable attacking your brother or your sister, saying mean things about them. But the second someone outside your family starts saying mean things, there's a circle of the wagons effect. And I think that partly explains the zigzag. So by the end of December, when the Whittaker Chambers review comes out, the famous review where he said, from every page of Atlas Shrugged drips the idea to the gas chamber, go. Murray was fighting mad, wrote a letter to Bill Buckley, wrote a letter to and wrote a note to Meyer saying, I take back what I said earlier. I misunderstood about the Randians, but of course there would be more zigs and zags to follow.
Yes, because my experience with the whole Rothbard-Rand connection just comes from his later works, right, where he had finally settled on, we're not fans of, right, always there was some sympathetic things to say about the philosophy,
correct,
and some of the comments, right, but nothing nice to say about the cult as Rothbard characterized it, which is fine with me, by the way. I've never actually even been affected by Rand very much. I tried reading the novels, they weren't for me. But like them, I admit some of these essays, like in that short book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, there's some good essays in that. It also contains Alan Greenspan's essay about the gold standard, which is a good essay. Unfortunately, Greenspan was a horrible careerist who had no real principles whatsoever. So that's just my experience with the Rand people. And you can read on Mises.org, by the way, the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult. We have it up there. And you also mentioned the play that Rothbard had written about Rand, and that's called Mozart Was a Red. It's a one-act play, and a few years ago, our students at Mises University acted it out. It was a lot of fun. It's nice and short, of course. And so, yeah, there's a lot of animosity there. And I recently edited a book by Ralph Raico in a 10-hour lecture series that he gave. And he embodies, I think, that idea. Had some nice things to say about what Rand's thoughts on industrialization were, but overall considered her to be very unsophisticated in her view of history and in her acknowledgement of other theorists and a crazed egotist and that sort of thing. And
well, I think the importance of these letters, I mean, there's always importance in history just for history's sake, and it's profoundly interesting, but I think it settles a few debates. And one of the things that the Randians said about Murray, I mean, obviously he gets kicked out unceremoniously in the summer of 1958, and they claim that he had plagiarized Rand's ideas. He had stolen her ideas on Aristotle and on natural rights. And so there was a question, and that later Murray came and trashed Rand, petulantly in a sour grapes way because of this charge. Now, there's a what came first, the chicken or the egg argument there. There's no argument anymore because in these letters, Murray is saying the same things that he said in the Sociology of the Ayn Rand Cult in 1972. Here he's saying them in 1957 to basically what's the sounding board, Frank Meyer. And we don't get really Frank Meyer's voice because Frank was a phone person. I mean, some of these years he was spending a quarter of his income on his telephone bills. And so Frank and Murray called each other on the phone. And one of the calls is at 2 in the morning or something like that. So that is settled. Murray didn't just make this stuff up, as the Randians claimed, to kind of get back at her, to smear her. He was saying it in real time in 1957. He didn't make it up 15 years later, saying the same stuff in this letter that he would say in the Sociology of the Ayn Rand Cult. The other thing that it settles is this idea that he stole natural rights and Aristotelianism, that he got all these ideas from Rand. Now, this has always been a very dubious, for anyone outside of objectivism, this has been profoundly ridiculous because the idea that a guy who got 3 degrees from an Ivy League institution suddenly came upon Aristotle just upon meeting Ayn Rand, I mean, that's ridiculous. So I don't know that there's many people that were sort of waiting to have some sort of confirmation that was false. I mean, it sort of was always false. However, in these letters, before Rothbard is in the inner circle of the Randians, he's literally saying to Meyer, I've always been a natural rights guy. I've always been an Aristotelian. I've always been this and that. And so their philosophy kind of meshes with my philosophy, the Randians. And so I feel comfortable 98% of the time. I feel comfortable because natural rights, Aristotle, this kind of thing, that's what I believe in too. And so the charge that's even been made in recent years that he got all this stuff, he stole it from Ayn Rand, that doesn't stand after you read these letters. It can't stand because he would have had to have anticipated what happened 9 months later of being, charged with plagiarism and all this kind of thing, and slipped this into letters in late 1957, and that's obviously preposterous. So that argument, such as there was an argument about that, there's no argument about that anymore.
And, I mean, I guess just as a final question then, did this in any way affect the relationship between Myers and Rothbard, or Meyer? I mean, I guess in the end, Meyer was proven right? Like Rothbard ended up agreeing with, to some extent, with probably Meyer's initial second thoughts, doubts about Rand. I suppose. I guess it might have improved their relationship. I don't know. I kind of, in terms of that, what do you get out of these letters in terms of, did it have any effect on the larger relationship between Rothbard and Meyer, or was it just two guys just kind of talking about what was a minor issue in their lives?
I think it was a major issue in Rothbard's life. I think for Meyer, I talked to his son, who actually subscribed to the Objectivist newsletter in the 1960s. He said he liked Meyer better than his dad, but he thought that his father, Frank Meyer, John Meyer, said that he thought that Rand was overall, more good than bad. She had some errors. He disagreed with her on some things. But what's remarkable is I have about 250,000 documents in my house sitting on this table all around. Obviously, I have these Rothbard letters that are here, but they're a part of a larger collection. And you would think that over the course of, 100,000 letters that Meyer would have talked about Rand. He mentions her a few times. She's not a big deal in his overall scheme of things. The other thing with Meyer is that he had these knockdown, drag-out fights with Harry Jaffa, with Brent Bozell, with Russell Kirk, with all sorts of figures on the American right. And oftentimes it really didn't damage the relationships. It certainly didn't damage his relationship with Brent Bozell. With Russell Kirk it did. And with Murray, I don't think there was any damage to the relationship because, the letters are very warm. They're seeing each other occasionally. They're talking on the phone. They're writing each other. And as Murray said when Frank died, that he took it as a great personal blow, his death. So I think, Murray did review Frank's book, The Molding of Communists, in a very kind of negative way. I think he, later, when you read the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult, he kind of took some of that back. And so he could be critical of Meyer, certainly. Meyer was a virulent anti-communist. He was in favor of the Vietnam War. And Murray, particularly in 1967, 1968, he was, disgusted with all that. And so he had some disgust in that review of Meyer's book about communists. So they disagreed with things, but they were friends till the end. They debated together at Harvard in 1971. And obviously the Volcker thing ends in the early 60s, but there was a bond there because they were the only two guys at Volcker that were basically giving their imprimatur to scholarship, to reviews. And because they were both doing it, I know Murray's stuff's online. I have Frank's reviews, and they could be quite harsh about people that were their friends because the only people reading those reviews were people inside of Volcker. So the type of reviews Frank was writing for National Review, they might give a friendly review to someone because they're a friend of the magazine or something like that. But within the Volcker stuff, it was, it could be harsh. And they were linked because of that forever.
Well, Daniel Flynn, thank you for joining us today here on Radio Rothbard. And if you're interested in any of this, I know a lot of these names are probably going to be unfamiliar to a lot of the listeners. Whittaker Chambers doesn't come up a lot anymore in daily discussion.
He doesn't. You can get, if you're just interested in the Rand stuff, go and read the Journal of Libertarian Studies article. If you're interested in Meyer, this is The Man Who Invented Conservatism, my new book, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. There's a lot of stuff on libertarians. I mean, Frank was mentored by Rose Wilder Lane. He's very tight with Frank Chodorow. He mentors David Brodnoy later. So there's a fair amount of libertarian stuff. It's more conservative movement stuff. But I think if people are interested in the history of it, go to the book. If you're just interested in the Rand, Rothbard stuff, certainly go to the Journal of Libertarian Studies article.
I think the book, your book, could offer some additional nice context, too, for people who are interested in the libertarian side of things, like, say, Rothbard's book, The Betrayal of the American Right, and those sort of things. I think you would get a lot more depth of understanding as to what was going on in the larger right-wing philosophical discussion at that time. So I do encourage even hard-line libertarians to be familiar with this period of time and thinking, because I do think it is relevant to where we are now in terms of libertarian thinking and where Murray was and where Lew Rockwell got a lot of his, I don't want to say influences, but just in terms of understanding what the intellectual milieu was at the time. I mean, I don't think you can really ignore this stuff if we're looking at people who were writing in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. So yeah, check out the book. It's The Man Who Invented Conservatism. And then the article from the Journal of Libertarian Studies is Murray Rothbard's Lost Letters on Ayn Rand. You can find that at Mises.org. So thank you, Daniel, for joining me today. Thank you, everyone out there, for listening. We'll be back next time with more. We'll see you then.